Ready to go, so it's great to be here. It's an event about the importance of women's entrepreneurship and the policy settings that governments need in order to promote equal opportunities in entrepreneurship, to address some of the inequalities that exist. And we've got a short and sharp event, and so I think we can start straight away with welcome remarks from Lamia Kamal Shawi, who's director of the OECD Centre for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. You are really improving in pronouncing my name with a great accent. Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here today alongside Colette Henry and such an inspiring panel to launch our new report on entrepreneurship policies through a gender lens. This report was prepared in partnership between the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities, and the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Research Project, the GWEP. So I would like to thank the GWEP for this very important collaboration. Promoting female entrepreneurship has been a high priority for the OECD for many years. It was a key feature of the 2013 OECD recommendation of the Council on Gender Equality in Education, Employment, and Entrepreneurship, to which all OECD countries, plus 4 partner countries, including Argentina, Kazakhstan, Morocco, and the Russian Federation, became adherent. And since 2013, our Missing Entrepreneurs program and our Committee on SMEs and Entrepreneurship have been looking at how public policy can encourage entrepreneurship within underrepresented groups such as women. That work has shown that in recent years, we began to see some progress toward closing the gap. The forthcoming 2021 edition of Missing Entrepreneurs will show that the gender gap in self-employment closed by about 15 percentage points between 2002 and 2019, and the gap among employer firms closed by even more, nearly 20 percentage points. However, there is a however, today's report shows that unfortunately COVID-19 has reversed some of this progress. And the reason being that women's entrepreneurs have higher representation in sectors that were hit the hardest, such as tourism, hospitality, and personal services. They were also 25% more likely to report that homeschooling and childcare had a negative impact on their business than male entrepreneurs in 2020. And despite the overall success of emergency support measures in reaching vulnerable firms and entrepreneurs, women have had particular difficulties in getting this support. Yesterday, our Secretary General Matthias Cormann launched the 2021 edition of the OECD flagship SMEs and Entrepreneurship Outlook at the occasion of the UN MSME Day. And that report presents a unique global overview and new data and evidence on the state of entrepreneurship, as well as the weaknesses, resilience, and growth potential of SMEs. And it shows that the large scale of COVID-19 support measures introduced by governments were generally not gender sensitive. Many programs still rely on existing bank products, and some supports have revenue or employment thresholds. And the fact is that women-owned enterprises might not benefit as much as others because on average, they are less likely to use bank loans or they are smaller. Tragically, therefore, we have lost too many female-led businesses during the pandemic. Globally, women-owned businesses had higher closure rates than men-owned businesses in 2020, actually 27% versus 20%, and supporting ecosystem have been weakened. And let us not forget that despite this recent progress that I mentioned, even before COVID-19, there remained a substantial gap between the participation of women and men in entrepreneurship. For example, between 2015 and 2019, less than 6% of women in OECD countries were actively involved in creating a business compared to more than 8% of men. Moreover, in large part, because of the types of business that women typically run and the barriers they face, they tend to generate less revenue and are less productive and resilient than those run by men. So there is still a huge challenge ahead of us as we look to close the gender gap in entrepreneurship. Too many women are still held back by cultural barriers, as well as a lack of skills and, of course, in access to finance and networks. So looking forward, we need to redouble our efforts to tackle these barriers and promote female entrepreneurship. And recovery packages provide an opportunity to do so, not just as a matter of fairness, but as a route to growth. Some estimates suggest that global GDP could rise by as much as 2% annually if we could eliminate the gender gap in entrepreneurship by releasing innovation and making better use of resources. So this new report that we're launching today on women entrepreneurship present policy insight from around the world and act as a guide for future policy actions to support women entrepreneurs. Let me now highlight three key messages from the report. First, more ambitious, coordinated, and sustained policies and programs are needed to promote women's entrepreneurship. The report highlights many good examples of initiatives to support women. For example, in Germany, the Frauenunternehmen initiative, which means in German, women entrepreneurs. By the way, I have practiced a lot to pronounce that name. This initiative has built a network of nearly 2,000 entrepreneurship role models and mentors for young girls and women to inspire the next generation of women entrepreneurs in Germany. Another inspiring example is the first women entrepreneurship strategy, the WES, which was introduced in 2018 in Canada with an initial investment of 2 billion Canadian dollar. And the WES strategy seeks to double the number of women-owned businesses by 2026. There is a target. And it also seeks to add 150 billion Canadian dollar to GDP. This program actually is supporting women's entrepreneurs through targeted capital, improved access to federal contracting, and a women entrepreneurship knowledge hub. Our new report, however, also shows that despite some good examples, like the one that I mentioned, initiatives around the world remain really too fragmented and too short-term. A second message from our report is that women's entrepreneurship policy intervention must be tailored to their local context. The report described the very different institutions, culture, and social norms that affect the opportunities and outcomes for women entrepreneurs across countries. And actually, policy needs to be sensitive to these differences. And there are some interesting examples. In some advanced economies, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, some policies tend to focus on developing the local entrepreneurial ecosystem, for example, by providing infrastructure such as incubator and accelerator, startup funding, and support networks for women. And there, local partners are often taking the lead. In Italy, a wide range of local measures aimed at promoting women's entrepreneurship have been developed, including, for example, in the Lazio region. The Lazio region is the one where Rome is based. There, the Innovazione Sostenitivo Femminile, another difficult name to pronounce, which means in Italian, in English, innovation column, feminine noun. I like very much this noun. This program provides funding to support the creation and development of innovative ideas and projects, while also promoting the adoption and use of new technology in women-led firms. And they are very much local driven. So for good reasons, policies in developing country, I was talking about advanced economy. Now for developing country, they tend to focus more on foundational challenges to gender equity, social justice, economic security, and empowerment. And in these countries, governments often need to first fulfill the basics of creating a legal and regulatory framework that supports women's entrepreneurship and tackles discrimination while providing access to the right network and resources. In many cases, both approaches will be needed, with the balance and implementation, again, depending on the local context. So overall, governments need not only to engage in a dialogue with women entrepreneurs to deepen their understanding of the barriers, but also involve women in key institution and decision making. And this includes, for example, setting up advisory bodies made up of women's entrepreneurship organizations to guide policy making, as well as ensuring a greater role for women on the supply side of financial markets. The third and last key message of the report that I'd like to highlight is that a test and learn approach can help identify and scale up programs that work. Strengthening our evidence of the impact of women's entrepreneurship policies and programs will be key to build the case for maintaining and expanding eventually support for successful policies. And to support this, we need better data. We need better data on the state of women's entrepreneurship, including the types of entrepreneurship pursued by men and women, the barriers faced to entrepreneurship in areas such as skills and finance, and the beneficiaries of entrepreneurship support programs. So to conclude, I'd like to say that the OECD is very proud to be supporting countries in their work to promote women's entrepreneurship. This new report is another milestone in this journey, combining so many different insights from experts across 27 OECD countries. I would like again to thank the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Research Project for collaborating with us on this work. And I also take the opportunity to thank Jonathan Potter and David Halabiski, the main author of this report. Thank you so much and congratulate to you. So we look forward to working with all of you who are present at this event to help unlock the talent and potential of women entrepreneurs through the recovery and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lamia. Great, and just to echo what you say, thanks go to the Global Women's Entrepreneurship Policy Project. And in fact, the main authors of the report are all the members of the expert teams in all the countries that we prepared notes, policy insight notes from, and that's the content of this report. 27 country case studies added to some OECD data. So it's very much a joint report put together by OECD and by GWEP. And so now we welcome Professor Colette Henry, who's chair of the Global Women Entrepreneurship Policy Project and one of the main editors of this piece from the GWEP side. So Colette, if you could give us some more of the key messages of the report, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan. And good afternoon to everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here at this launch today. I want to thank the OECD for all their hard work in getting this report to fruition, and especially Jonathan and David, and of course Celine and Lamia for supporting today's event. And two excellent co-editors that I had the pleasure of working with, Barbara Orser, Susan Coleman, and of course the 27 global WEP research teams across those 27 countries who contributed to today's report. So I think, Audrey, are you going to put up some slides for me, if that's okay? Thank you. And what I want to just do over the next few minutes is highlight some other findings in the report that I think are worthy of attention. So next slide, please. So maybe just to give you a little bit of the context, I mean, you're obviously familiar with the OECD. You may not be quite as familiar with the Global Web Research Network. And we're simply, as has already been said, a group of international scholars very, very interested in the area of women's entrepreneurship and policy. We started the group in 2014 with just a handful of interested scholars, and very quickly that grew to 13 countries. And today we're delighted to say we've got 35 country research teams involved in Global Web. As I said, 27 of those have contributed to this report. So this really is the result of a unique collaboration, and we're absolutely delighted to have been involved, and hope that this will lead to other collaborations of this nature. So if we go to the next slide, please.
There might be a little bit of a décalage between the, can you see the next slide?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, good.
Thank you. So if you've had a look at the report, if you've had an opportunity to do that, you'll see that the report is structured around 6 key themes or 6 pillars. And the first one there, fostering a gender-sensitive entrepreneurship culture. You'd have countries such as Australia and India falling under that theme. In the next thing, strengthening the design and delivery of support. Countries like Canada and New Zealand are in that category. Building an entrepreneurship skills. You'll see Denmark and Tanzania under that heading. So these are the themes that the research teams chose to focus on. They felt that they were particularly critical in the context of women's entrepreneurship policy. Facilitating access to financial capital turned out to be the most popular thing, because the research teams felt that that was one of the major barriers to promoting women's entrepreneurship. So a number of the policy insights, in fact 8 of them, will focus on that particular theme. And in that category, countries like Ethiopia and the United States are noteworthy. And in terms of supporting networks, countries like Scotland and the Palestinian Authority are in there as good examples. And finally, building a supportive regulatory environment. Countries like Kenya and Pakistan would be examples there. So next slide, please. But of course, there are lots of different ways you can look at and critique and evaluate the findings. And I find this sort of 5-element framework quite useful in just digging a little bit deeper into what we find. The first little circle there, countries with no women's entrepreneurship policy. It should come as no surprise that we find across the 27 countries a number of countries with no women's entrepreneurship policy at all. And indeed, where women's entrepreneurship was mentioned within the broader entrepreneurship framework of the country, it was only done so very fleetingly or perhaps with very little visibility. Now, we consider the lack of a woman's formal entrepreneurship policy in a country to be a fundamental flaw, because if you think of it, if governments are really keen on promoting equality in entrepreneurship, then they've got to have women's entrepreneurship embedded in that national formal enterprise policy. So this wasn't an uncommon finding in the report. As I say, in some areas where women were mentioned in the mainstream policy, it was barely visible. An example here is Northern Ireland, because the research team there concluded that the lack of women entrepreneurs and the fact that women entrepreneurs in Northern Ireland are about half as likely as men to become entrepreneurs is due to the fundamental absence of a dedicated women's entrepreneurship policy. Now, in the next category, we find also that there were countries with women's entrepreneurship policy, perhaps not a formal one, but in the overarching framework, there was much more mention of women's entrepreneurship. But the policies don't work. And we find that a number of countries fell into this category because their policies were very often at odds with the rest of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So in other words, there may have been a component of the entrepreneurial ecosystem that was absent, but upon which the policy relied. Therefore, it wasn't as effective as it could have been. Now, perhaps an unexpected example in this category is Germany, because despite notable increases in women's entrepreneurship in recent years, many of their policies are still designed around this male breadwinner and traditional stereotypical role, presenting entrepreneurship as not a very desirable career path for women. So in fact, some of the aspects of those policies are discouraging. Pakistan could be another, perhaps more expected example within this particular category, where the levels of women's entrepreneurship are amongst the lowest in the world. The Pakistani research team highlighted the weak regulatory systems which serve to facilitate discrimination, lack of access to financial capital, and lack of family and social care policies as key ecosystems issues that are working against the introduction of any policy that is designed or intended to promote women's entrepreneurship. The report also found countries with women's entrepreneurship policy initiatives or programs that appear to work quite well. Some good practice examples here, of course, include Canada, with their very dedicated women entrepreneurship strategy, and the UK with their Women in Innovation Awards, which have proved really successful in highlighting women innovators and promoting women's entrepreneurship. So the research team also uncovered countries where there were policies that supported women's entrepreneurship, but with no actual programs on the ground, or only partial programs in operation. One example that could be considered here is Kenya, where women constitute almost half of micro to small enterprises and represent the largest proportion of the informal economy. And yet, despite government acknowledging this, there is no program of social protection for women in this sector, making it very, very difficult for them to start a business. In some other countries, policies lacked the necessary targets or specific definitional criteria or evaluative programs that would be required to make them effective. And finally, within this framework, our research teams also found countries where there were some very good women's entrepreneurship programs on the ground, but no formal overarching women's entrepreneurship policy. And again, for Global WEP, this is really, really important, because if governments are serious about supporting women's entrepreneurship, that mandate needs to be apparent in the overarching policy. Because without women's entrepreneurship being mentioned in overarching policy, very good programs on the ground perhaps could be in danger of running out of funding, or their key champion who is passionate about this agenda perhaps leaving. So for sustainability, and this is a point that Lamia already mentioned, for sustainability, we need these policies to be embedded in the national frameworks. So an example here could be Ireland, where despite some excellent programs on the ground, particularly with regard to funding, there's no dedicated women's entrepreneurship policy. And also Mexico, where there's some really good funding and support programs in operation, such as Mujeres Moviendo Mexico. And yes, I practice that too, but there's no main overarching women's entrepreneurship policy. So just next slide, please. So what can we take away from the report? And Lamia, in her opening remarks, has referred to a couple of these points already, certainly in terms of sustainability and the need for everything to be linked up to the ecosystem. So one thing we find that I think was a little bit surprising is that in policies where women were mentioned, they're still referred to as minority, lacking skills, in deficit, and of course, needing to be fixed. We thought we'd moved away from that debate, but we haven't actually. The next thing was that we find that access to financial capital is still a major barrier and a hot topic for researchers in this area, because without relevant access to financial capital, women entrepreneurs can't grow their businesses. So that's still a major barrier. We also find that there's a lot of support going to HPSUs, high potential startups, technology-based, export-oriented, growth-oriented businesses. But we also need support, and we need policy intervention in those sectors where women do predominate. Because what about all the millions of women that are not in the high tech, high growth? And of course, there are very strong economic arguments for supporting those sectors. But when most of the women are not in those sectors, one can get the impression that all of the other businesses aren't that important, which is, of course, not the message that we want to be sending. So it's back to this point of embedding women's entrepreneurship formally within the country's overarching formal entrepreneurship policy and making it visible there, or indeed having a separate women's entrepreneurship policy, but to take it really seriously. As Lamia said at the beginning, policies need to be linked to the wider ecosystem, because if there are deficits there, policies and programs will not be effective. There is a need for monitoring and evaluation, defining criteria better, setting targets. And that's important because if we don't know what works, we can't identify good practice examples and really learn from those. And if we don't know what doesn't work, then we can't actually fix it and put things right. So we knew at the beginning when we started out on this project that women entrepreneurs are not a homogenous group. And that is a message that has really been hammered home by this report. Women entrepreneurs have different needs in different countries, different contexts, different situations. Even within sectors, there are different needs. And we can only deal with that by, as Lamia said at the beginning, having women in the decision-making process about policies and about programs. And finally, it comes as no surprise that when it comes to women's entrepreneurship policy, one size just does not fit all. So I'll end it there. So thank you very much for listening, and back to you, John.
Well, thank you very much, Colette. It's very, very clear. And, you know, what this is all about is to try and advise governments on how they could overcome some of these problems that are leading to a gender gap in entrepreneurship. And so the way we're going to do it next is to invite on board a panel of people from different, slightly different countries and circumstances, and get their view. So we're going to start up the panel now. Now the audience, you have the opportunity. What I would suggest you do is put some points in the chat, some questions or some comments, and we'll be putting those to members of the panel, possibly to speakers as we go along. So get your points and your questions ready so that we can pick a few of those out and discuss them in the next hour. The members of the panel are Dr. Margot Thomas, who is CEO and founder of WEI Forward. We've got Virginia Littlejohn, CEO and founder of Quantum Leaps. Roshini Narendaran from the University of Tasmania, and a contributor to the report on India, and Yulia Ulik from the incubator, the Accent Incubator, Austria, and the EU SARA project. What we're going to do is start off with a broad question for everybody. And I'd like to ask Virginia to start us off. I mean, could you give us your view, Virginia, on what governments need to do to close the gender gap in entrepreneurship?
Absolutely, Jonathan. First of all, I have to say that this is unbelievably exciting for me because in 1996, I talked the OECD into organizing the world's first Women Entrepreneurial Best Practice Conference for 1997, of which we had almost no best practices in the world. We then did a follow-up in 2000 and another in 2004, and then two regional ones in Istanbul in 05 and 06. So it's so exciting, Colette, Jonathan, and David, to see what you all have brought together with your team. I will be speaking from the point of view of the Women's 20, known as the W20 of the G20 countries, and tell you some of the recommendations that we are making to deal with exactly these points in our upcoming communique that will be released next month. So there are 5 areas that we will be talking about, all of which relate to your central question. Ensuring equal rights to ownership of assets, including ownership of land, bank accounts, and inheritance rights. That's a big issue to women, 40% of the women in the world. Also developing and promoting innovative and easily accessible financial solutions and products, including digital tools and microfinance. Then one of the important issues in your new publication, creating policy frameworks and strategic growth initiatives for women-owned businesses, both within those sectors that have been hardest hit by the pandemic, and also creating incentives to fund innovative sectors that are poised for growth, scalability, and the creation of employer firms. That's an area that has been overlooked in many countries for a long time. Also developing actionable strategies with commensurate funding to overcome program gaps in entrepreneurial ecosystems relating both to entrepreneurship and innovation. Then in the accountability department under the second issue, calling for G20 countries to do annual goal setting and reporting on progress toward the creation of these frameworks. And we've indicated many areas in which we wish them to focus. And this is in line with the G20 Data Gaps Initiative. The third area, and we've been trying to push this one for a long time, creating public procurement and access to markets initiatives, implementing policies for a minimum of a 5% annual public procurement spend with women-owned SMEs. The current percentage is less than 1% globally, and also providing incentives for large government contractors to subcontract at least 5% of the contract value to women-owned SMEs. And this is both by 2030. And finally, under that issue, establishing national annual goals and reporting for public and corporate procurement, international trade, and e-commerce. We're particularly interested in e-commerce as a way of getting women into a major growth area, as I think changes are happening in retail. The fourth area has to do with access to finance and capacity building for solopreneurs and micropreneurs. All businesses must be able to be owned and titled in a woman's name rather than having her male partner or a relative as a co-signatory. And also given that a very significant number of women lost their jobs due to COVID, providing incentives and an enabling environment for self-employment to minimize long-term unemployment claims, and then providing training to enable women to transition from solopreneurs to employer businesses if they so desire, and from the informal to the formal sector if they so desire, but with an emphasis on coming up with some incentives to do that. Fifth one is promoting private and public investment, and also incentivizing philanthropists to incorporate a gender lens into their funding decisions across all asset classes, encouraging many more women to become angel investors and venture capital investors. We're going to be creating peer learning networks to help facilitate this process. We also are interested in tracking not only companies that are only woman-founded, but also male and female co-founded employer companies, reporting annually on progress in the access to capital area with all asset classes, and ensuring that a proportional share of country-specific COVID-19 recovery funds go to the relative number of women-owned and led SMEs and scale-ups in that country. So that's part of what we'll be officially launching in the 13th to the 15th of July in Rome at the W20 summit this year.
All right, the W20 summit on the 13th to 15th of July in Rome, and that's another place where this agenda will get pushed forward. You've stressed a lot the finance issue, and you mentioned ownership of assets as well. I mean, is it possible for you to highlight just one or two sort of key actions? You know, what's the most important thing that a government needs to do? And does it differ between developing and developed countries?
I think there are some real differences between developed and developing. One of our biggest, I don't want to say anything about till the summit. So I think that the angel investment initiative is a really important one because there's so much reinvention of the wheel that happens from one country to another. And there are some excellent examples that can be shared across countries. That will be one area that we will have a strong focus on. Another thing that's very related to the funding issue, though, is financial literacy. And that is an issue both at the developing country level and OECD countries. I mean, it's a big issue in the United States, has been for years, and a great deal of really important work can be done in that area, including for growth-oriented companies. Many larger women-owned firms in the US and OECD countries think that's still an area where they need to do a lot of work. And women's business associations, if they are supported and encouraged by their governments, can play a significant role in this area. Also, if incentives can be provided to banks and VC firms and angel investment firms, linking the training with the capacity building and the financial side of things, I think that can also be very important. And then we'll be making a big announcement at the summit in July on one other initiative.
Well, we look forward to the big announcement in the middle of July. Great. We'll move to another perspective for a moment, and I'll ask you, Julia Ulik, from the incubator and from Sarah. It's the same basic question, but from your perspective, you know, what are the most important things that governments need to do to close this gender gap?
Mm-hmm. I can agree to many points that Virginia just said. It's very, very interesting. And also, and now from my side, congratulations on the great report. I think it's really a unique collection of data, and I think we will also use it in our incubator for inspiration. So thank you for that. And yeah, maybe thinking about closing the gender gap, actions from government, what comes to my mind is very much the question, who is involved in these actions? So where does the expertise come from? And one current case in Austria we have is that since last year, the government has been involving startup relevant topics in the form of an own committee and a startup appointee as well. And this current appointee, she's an entrepreneur herself. So the position itself is not focused on gender topics, but now the current appointee is an entrepreneur, And she's herself co-founder of the Female Founders Association in Austria, that is an accelerator for female entrepreneurs. And we can see that based on this new role that was established, the government receives firsthand evaluations from an expert in the field, because she herself, she has gone through launching a company, going through the whole process, talking to banks and investors, etc. So there may be some potential there that she points maybe in different directions or to different points that could be interesting for change, and also for maybe creating new ways in the ecosystem of collaboration. So this would be my first thought on closing the gender gap. The second one is maybe more on the soft skill side. I think it is very important to encourage new narratives of a female entrepreneurship. For me, it would be interesting to see specific incentives that help change existing narratives in society. So just an example, if a woman changes from being an employee to an entrepreneur, it may be the narrative that she just wants to avoid hierarchy conflicts as an employee, that's the reason why she leaves, or maybe that she had no other option to change her professional life. So I find this quite remarkable, because why are we speaking of avoidance in first place, and not speaking of the woman's very proactive step and a solid decision to become an entrepreneur? I think this is really interesting. And I think that very often language and narratives, they reproduce inequalities. So as an incubator in our daily business, we see many of these narratives circling around. And what's also very interesting, they are also retold by female entrepreneurs themselves. So this is also something we are working on. And I think narratives, they are important because they should really offer more role models at every level of society. So in universities, in regions, at the stakeholders. There it would be interesting to have some incentives that new stories are told, inspiring stories of female entrepreneurs. And of course, before that, institutions have to make these stories possible, of course. So I think this, I know I'm here more on the soft skill side, but I think this is a quite powerful item. And maybe thirdly, I would like to also connect what Lamia said before, because she highlighted the local context as a key finding. I would see it in my daily work, we see that there are some bottom-up initiatives, local ones in villages, in small towns, that are very interesting. And I think you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are already existing interesting initiatives a government can use and can involve in their discussions. Sometimes they are not profit-oriented, but they serve a societal and educational purpose. So for example, we have, I know some associations, they're called Technology Kids, or some associations around robotics and girls. So I think there is quite some potential to tap into. And I think more attention could be paid to these initiatives to inspire next generations, that they can learn their skills. So this would be somehow my conclusion.
Well, very good. You're talking about the narratives of female entrepreneurship, and you're talking about role models. And I have a question to follow up, which is to ask you, maybe you could say what inspires your entrepreneurs on your incubator to be entrepreneurs, and does that tell us anything about the narratives or the role models we need?
Many of the entrepreneurs that, or aspiring entrepreneurs that come to us, they want to see an impact. They want to see an impact of what they have done in their former professional or private life. And they really want to see it on the market, want to see the impact, and also want to see somehow a flexibility to live their dreams. So I think it's a very intrinsic motivation they have here. Nevertheless, of course, also financial resources are very, very important. But I think that really impact for most of them is a great category. And we can see that we have no specific program at the moment for females, but we are working in our Sarah project to see if there are maybe design options for programs to better address female entrepreneurs.
Very good. Well, thank you. There was a question in the chat. I'm not going to do all of them, but a simple one here. Where can we obtain the report? So it's not for you, Julia. It's for everybody who's on the call, if you're wondering. And we put at the very top of the chat a link. So go up to the very top of the chat and you'll see that it's available on iLibrary, the OECD iLibrary. And you search for this publication, Entrepreneurship Policies Through the Gender Lens. And as with all of the OECD publications, it's available free to read online. And I think you'll find that if you want to take away a copy, then you have to pay for download. But the point is, it's free for everybody right now on there to read online. So anyway, let's move on to the next panelist. And I don't think, I am told that Roshini is perhaps not here from Australia. So we'll ask Margot Thomas to come in from WEI Forward and make a few points, Margot. Of course, the overall issue is, what do you think governments can do to help address this gender gap in entrepreneurship?
Thank you very much. You know, and I want to start out by complimenting the OECD for facilitating and creating the space for this discussion at this particular point in time, and also to recognize the Global Web and their network and the report that they've produced with their contributors, because I think it really helps us to come to terms with, or to better understand the issues that on the ground across a range of countries and economies. And we know that this is not a one size fits all, or it's not a homogeneous group of women that we're talking about. So I think they've really added texture and a context to the detail to this discussion in a way that's relevant. The question that I was asked to address really in terms of how can governments close the gender gap from a policy perspective, I think it's important to recognize that policies are inherently gender blind. And this is due to the structural and systemic biases across economies and societies related to the role of women in the economic space. So that's an important starting point. The next point that I would make is that, without repeating what we've heard so far, because I think there's a broad understanding of what are some of the barriers and the impediments to women's economic participation. In addition to roles, we've talking about entrepreneurship, specifically access to finance, access to digital resources, access to networks, and of course, the regulatory environment. Big areas. And we've heard, I think, in Virginia's crafting of some of those responses and what we've heard from others, they're important. So I want to shift the gaze a little bit and take a little bit a more disruptive approach, if you don't mind. The COVID-19 pandemic has not just exacerbated the issues affecting women in the economic space, but it has also forced governments and policymakers to take a different approach to addressing economic shocks in order to be more resilient and to stimulate growth and recovery. There's an opportunity here at the very beginning for us to push for a more inclusive approach to policymaking. This point in itself is not new. We've been talking about gender mainstreaming. The OECD has done a lot of work on this area, and in 2018, I wrote a policy brief for the Think 20 on the topic. But I think at this particular point in time, given the importance of women in the economic sector, whether it's in the formal or the informal or the informal sector, we have an opportunity to revisit the very basis on which inclusive economic growth needs to be generated, and therefore the policies that underlie inclusive economic growth need to be developed. So I really want to make a push for that, because I think now is the time for us to get governments focused on this in order to come up with a systematic approach to addressing the needs, not just of women, but other underrepresented and vulnerable groups. Because we will not be able to respond to future shocks appropriately if these things are not taken into account. The COVID-19 pandemic also has, I think, forced governments to recognize that they need to adopt an intersectional approach to policymaking. Who would have thought that the IMF and the WHO, the World Health Organization, would be coming together to craft responses to the economic impact of the pandemic? If we can carry through this thinking and this approach to shifting how we make policies in order to be more inclusive, then I think there are benefits not just for women and underrepresented groups, but related to the discussion we're having here today. One of the elements, and I think Lamia pointed it out also, the Missing Entrepreneurs report that's forthcoming, is the observation that many of the programs and policies that target women's economic activity are fragmentary, they're vulnerable to political changes, and as a result, over time, their impact is limited. So again, in keeping with my theme, I think there's an opportunity now for us to push for a more systemic and systematic approach to addressing the issues of women's entrepreneurship as we make national plans. It's echoing something that we've heard here earlier and some of the comments from our others, but I want to highlight it. So I'm excited when I see, for example, the government of Canada using a feminist approach to the economic response and recovery to the pandemic. It's a starting point, but it's indicative of a shift in thinking that's essential. So you don't add these issues as an afterthought or in response to other stimuli, but from the very beginning. That is, I think, is the critical shift that we need to be making.
Thank you very much. So you're going institutional and looking at the whole institutions across economies and societies, and you're asking for a systematic approach.
Yes.
As we make national plans. What sort of national plans do you mean, and what sort of systematic approach, and which country would be the best model?
As I alluded, I think what we've seen in the case of Canada is indicative of what's possible, but I wouldn't term it the best model. I think there's a lot of work to be done. And this is why I would refer us to think in terms of the models for gender mainstreaming. We've seen different versions of it, but we need to do some thinking and some work around how we make this happen. So what are the essential elements for gender mainstreaming? It's, first of all, inclusion in the design of policies and thinking of responses, right? It includes looking at the impact of policies on disadvantaged and affected groups and systematically assessing those impacts a priori and post policy. It's linking the issues of budgeting and allocation of resources from the government side in particular, in order to ensure that there are resources dedicated to supporting the policy initiatives that are being put in place, but not as a band-aid, but more systematically, so that it can be sustained. And then, of course, there's a critical element, and it's a fact that undermines this approach to policymaking needs to be addressed: data. We need to do a much better job of collecting data that are important for this level of decision making and in order to sustain it.
Thank you. I'd like to go round again, in fact. So Virginia, you're back on. I'm going to try this question with you. How should governments balance supporting the solo self-employed? You know, women who are going to really just run a business for themselves, relative to those with greater ambitions and potential. How do they deal with this distinction?
I think they need to recognize that one size does not fit all, that it's a continuum of growth possibilities. Some people are only interested in one version or the other, but I think we need to have a glide path to growth as part of the thinking. When the women's business centers were set up in the United States after the Women's Business Ownership Act of 1988, the focus was more on poverty alleviation, creating economic opportunities for people, and they did not really think about it as a potential continuum, a launch pad that could both help people who wanted to create home-based businesses that worked with their family responsibilities, etc., as well as people who might want to grow. Because of that, other initiatives came up in the ecosystem that were not really funded by government so much, but were women's business associations that felt they needed to bridge the gap. So one of them, for example, was, well, 3 or 4 came up that had to do with access to corporate procurement as a major area. They provided training. They then partnered with major corporations. So I'm thinking, for example, of WeBank, Women's Business Enterprise National Council in the US, which is heavily focused on corporate markets. But there needs to be, in my personal opinion, more thinking about how you deal with all components of the ecosystem, what organizations can help meet those needs. And that can be a hybrid, you know, with some government funding, some private sector funding, women entrepreneurial, et cetera. But it can't be thinking in silos of different sectors.
Yes, and I guess you could say that women entrepreneurs are not homogenous.
Exactly, exactly.
So how about Julia? You've been talking about differences in attitudes and also probably self-perceptions between men and women entrepreneurs. Do you think that would have any impact on how you should deliver policy support to entrepreneurs?
Thank you for that question. At the moment, we deliver programs that are not so specific for women, but what we see is that, of course, attitudes and self-perception, they are always the starting point in giving support. It's a core topic in every coaching, every support session we give as an incubator, because attitudes make a lot of what actually the entrepreneur is, how he or she defines himself or herself, and how he or she acts. I want to say that this is an overall approach we have. So this does not only apply to gender. Of course, we see female entrepreneurs coming, but they are also, there are also other socio-demographic criteria we have to take into account. How old are they? From which social status do they derive from? Are they from low tech or high tech? There are different criteria, and we see the entrepreneur as a whole. But what we see that in delivering our support programs, we have to be very much alert to different topics that might pop up totally surprisingly sometimes. So only 4 weeks ago, a female entrepreneur told me, "You see, Julia, I will withdraw from the investor talks I'm having because I see I don't do that well. And my co-founder, who's a junior position, my co-founder, he is much more accepted from the investors than me. But she is she has 20 years experience. And so this, for example, is for me the sign, total alert, we have to do something about this topic. And then we do more individual coachings on this. We also go to external experts who do trainings about this. And I think also a very good approach, if you ask about how it is delivered, the support, is that we have community formats. So for example, in the SARA project, we see that this is very valuable, that the requirements that sometimes come with gender roles, being a female entrepreneur, they are often discussed and experienced behind private doors. It's still, for example, the question of how to live, work-life balance, etc. I sometimes have the impression that some entrepreneurs tend to singularize themselves or even isolate because they think it's only their problem. And then what we do is to really invent or set up formats where they can have an exchange, where they can build up alliances and see from others what is actually possible. How do I deal with this? So I think that's also what Virginia said about the peer learning networks. I think this is a very, very important format.
All right. Well, we've saved a difficult question for Margot. To what extent do programs need to be dedicated to women, i.e., for women only?
I think this is a tricky question. So if you don't mind, as you admitted, was the difficult one. I want to reframe it in the sense that I want to assert at the very beginning that along the lines of what we've heard so far, it's important to have programs dedicated to women, but we need to recognize that these are short-term measures. Short to medium term. They should be targeted to address certain issues within or market failures or to trigger movement in particular areas around, for example, ownership of assets, in order to respond to the very specific needs that we envision, that we can see where there's a need to help women. But in parallel, we cannot lose sight of the fact that we need to really work on changing systemic and structural barriers. If not, we will always be in the same position of having to respond to these very thorny issues on an ongoing basis without dealing with some of the fundamental issues that are so easily overlooked.
Okay, yeah, good. And so having the programs is not enough in itself either.
No. And hence the push for this need to think differently or have a more inclusive approach to policy making in the first place. And secondly, I think we need to do a better job of measuring women's economic contribution and understanding what we all stand to lose or what we forego in terms of growth. And therefore the impact, not just on our current generation, men and women, girls and boys, but on future generations. And when we look at that in terms of sustainability, in terms of the financial and socioeconomic factors, these are things I think the pandemic has really given us an opportunity to take a step back at and look at them in this light.
We've got a few things going on in the chat, a few things, not quite so much, but there's a few questions that have gone in there, I'm, it's open to anyone to come in, so you can also raise your hand. Now there's somebody is asking Barbara Orser if she can share a link to her framework on agenda proofing for entrepreneurship programs. Barbara, do you want to say a quick word about that as well as putting a link in?
Well, bonjour, hello everyone, and thank you for that question. So I think what they're asking for is our technical report, Gender Smart Entrepreneurship Education and Training. And if that is of interest, I'll just throw the report in the chat. I don't know if I can do that, Jonathan. Perhaps I'll just share the link.
Or you could email David and David will stick it in.
Will do.
Yeah, but can you tell us anything about it?
We're working with a number of teams around the world, including Margot Thomas and Women's Economic Imperative, and research being funded by Social Science Humanities Research Council of Canada, so several teams, looking at assessment criteria to review courses and programs. And really, this is a sub-theme of the OECD report that Colette and Susan will be talking about. And so this is a focused intervention.
Good.
May I add to that? Coming back to my point about the structural, I think this particular initiative is also looking from a human capital perspective. Where are some of the critical points of intervention? And it's around education. How do we educate people on entrepreneurship? And is there inherent bias? And I think this is where the GEAT is a very good point of departure for investigating and perhaps identifying some solutions around the issue of women's entrepreneurship and how women in the entrepreneurial space are viewed and taught about and supported.
Yeah, and Colette, can you come in?
Yes, I just wanted to comment in terms of Barbara's framework for gender proofing and making sure that programs are more equitable. And we're actually going to adopt that framework for a major new European project, which I'm not allowed to talk about because it's embargoed for a few weeks. But we'll be applying that in practice. And that's really exciting for us, for me, because we haven't actually done that before. We pay some attention, but to have a systematic framework that we can start to apply to entrepreneurship programs would be fantastic.
All right, well, there are a bunch of questions in the chat, and our panelists and speakers are welcome to come back in and put their hands up and say they want to address one. But I'll just pick a couple out. I mean, there's somebody who says, that make a good point. You say that women ask for less bank loans and that they run smaller businesses. But that might be because it is what they prefer to do. Can anyone comment on that? Any implications of that? Any of the panelists?
Actually, Barbara Orser might be a good commentator on that. Barbara.
Sorry, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question because there was some background noise here.
Yeah,
Jonathan?
the point has been made that women ask for less bank loans and run smaller businesses, but that might be what they prefer to do. So what's the implication for policy?
Yeah, I think the implication for policy is around financial literacy or acumen, in that there is a cost of not asking for enough capital, that being underfinanced, trying to cross the chasm with cash flow issues, and understanding the implications of ratios and pricing and margins, and all of that factors into requested types and amounts of capital. Canadian and other work clearly points out that there are consistent gender differences in the level of financial acumen. So interventions defined in policy, I think, as well as the W20 support, investment in better understanding and supporting women entrepreneurs in their financial literacy.
There's a question about whether women should be allowed the choice to remain informal rather than being obliged to migrate to formality if they want to access any of this policy support. Can anyone give a view? Virginia, maybe? Yeah.
Yes. So what we said in our W20 language was that this should be incentivized rather than made absolutely mandatory, because there are a number of countries where women who have micro enterprises that are not registered consider it punitive. In some cases, there is corruption in terms of registration fees and so forth. So it's quite a different situation from one country to another. I'd be interested, Colette, if there was any further discussion about that amongst the authors.
Yeah, not so much so. I think what we picked up in the report was, the focus, the predominant focus on high growth, high tech, export oriented, which suggests that not a lot of attention was being given to the small or micro businesses. I think too, from a regulatory perspective, sometimes you get to a certain stage if you're self-employed, when the tax implications and all the bureaucracy is just as difficult as if you were a more formal limited company. Exactly. So I think it's perhaps back to financial literacy and ensuring women understand tax implications and the regulatory issues to maybe help them make the decision as to whether or not they should be a more formal enterprise.
So I think one last thing, maybe before Susan Coleman comes in, would be from United Nations. ESCAP made some interesting points in the chat, and there's something behind it. The point was made that multi-stakeholder groups and committees can be important to driving policy. Every country is different. You need entry points into the country to design contextual solutions. And so the question is, I mean, how do you influence policy? How do you influence policy, not just the women dedicated programs and making sure that they get put in place, but also how do you influence all those other ministries? Has anybody from the panel or the speakers got a view on that?
If I may step in here, I mean, I spoke in very general terms, but to me, this is where the whole approach to policymaking needs to be more inclusive. And if there is a more robust mechanism for consultation and therefore bringing in or taking on board the inputs of different groups and multi-stakeholders, this is one way of getting to that point. So I think really rethinking how we create policy and who's involved. It's not just about having women be part of government, but it's also ensuring that we have a more inclusive approach to the design of policies. This is where I think we get more useful and beneficial outcomes.
Okay.
Jonathan, could I briefly
Yes.
respond to that as well?
Yeah, I think you should go ahead.
Okay. There was a Canadian researcher whom Barbara, I'm sure, knows well, but Lois Stevenson did some very interesting research in the early 2000s dealing with what would be a country with low-level, mid-level, or high-level engagement, inclusiveness, etc. She did it with, I believe, a Swedish researcher. And among the things that she looked at was one initiative we had in the United States called the National Women's Business Council that was advisory to Congress, which is our legislature, to the head of our Small Business Administration and the President of the United States. That kind of organization, if it were more prevalent in other countries, combined with many of the kinds of things Canada has been doing that have really moved the ball in recent years with, you know, the budgeting piece, etc. I think among other things, and Colette, I would say it to you and your GWEP team, having another review of what Lois originally did, driving it across the OECD, the G20, UN Women, etc., could really, really have impact, I think, and identify some of the best practices that Barbara Orser and some other members of the W20 Women's Entrepreneurship Working Group have worked on. I think if we collaborated across some of those groups, we could come up with some really superb best practices. Right now, everybody's reinventing the wheel. It just drives me crazy. And I think that the OECD and GWEP and W20 and UN Women, et cetera, could really play a very important role in helping create some coherence, and also WEI. We've got some great people at the table for it. Thank you.
And you know, it's great to have UN and all the people here today. And of course, we have our book, and the point of this GWEP OECD book is in order to draw attention of government policymakers to what they can do. So we need to promote this book and make sure that the messages now are heard and understood. But I think we pass now for the closing remarks to Professor Susan Coleman, University of Hartford in the United States. She's one of the GWEP team, of course, one of the editors from GWEP. So over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning, because it's actually morning where I am. So I'm eating a bowl of cereal instead of having my afternoon cocktail. It's wonderful to be here with you, and I want to thank my fellow editors, Jonathan and David from the OECD, and Colette and Barbara Orser from the Global Web Group. In addition, I want to thank most heartily the authors of our 27-country report. It was really fabulous to work with you, and your expertise, diligence, persistence, and patience with repeated rounds of revisions were much appreciated and really have made this report what it has become today. What I'd like to talk about is a couple of the points that have been raised today, and to sort of highlight some of the things that I think are important. First of all, global women's entrepreneurship policy is alive and well. And this report provides ample evidence of that. With that said, however, it's still a work in progress. As Colette indicated, we saw policies without practices, we saw practices without policies, we saw inconsistencies between policies and practices. So there's still a lot of work to be done on the policy side. Why is that important? It's important because a policy framework is essential for identifying needs, highlighting gaps, and ensuring cohesion. Unless you have that overarching framework, you really don't, you can't be sure that all your bases are covered and that everything works together to form a cohesive whole. Another thing that I think is important, and several of our panelists talked about this, policies serve as a means for anchoring practices. And within the report, we saw examples where there were some very good programs that weren't anchored to an overarching policy, and they vanished after a period of time because there were no roots to keep the plant grounded. And so that overarching framework of policy is so critical as a means for identifying programmatic needs, but also helping to guarantee their security and longevity. One of our key takeaways from this project was the importance of context in determining appropriate policies and practices. And this is something Lamia talked about at the very beginning. We saw instances where countries that shared similar characteristics and challenges as being more likely to target similar types of needs through similar types of policies and practices. As an example of that, and this is something Virginia talked about, in developing economies, we saw policies and practices directed towards foundational challenges. Things like gender equality, women's empowerment, overcoming social and cultural biases, and in some instances, safety. Conversely, in developed economies, issues revolved more around industry-based gender biases and access to financial capital, and the importance of building and developing networks. Another takeaway, and both Julia and Virginia touched upon this, is the spectacular heterogeneity of women's entrepreneurship, not only across countries, but within countries. These diverse types of businesses are driven by differences in context, differences in access to networks and resources, and difference in the entrepreneur's opportunities, skills, circumstances, and motivations. And motivation for women, possibly for all entrepreneurs, but certainly for women, motivations are a big part of the kind of business they choose to establish, what industry they choose, their preferences for growth, and the like. So it's really a continuum of women's entrepreneurship, not one size fits all. And all of the steps in that continuum are important. They're all important, they're all valuable. A third takeaway, and this is something that just about everybody talked about, was the need for systematic data gathering and analysis to determine what works and what doesn't. This also provides opportunities for sharing success stories and best practices. Surprisingly, or perhaps not surprisingly, our country reports revealed very little evidence of that. And that's true for both developed and developing economies. So we have a real gap out there in terms of the kind of knowledge we can derive from effective data gathering and analysis, and using that data and analysis for decision making and for sharing best practices. One of the topics that came up, and again, several of our panelists talked about this, was the impact of COVID on women, and the fact that that impact on women entrepreneurs has been so much more devastating than it has been for men. And I think prior to COVID, women were making some pretty respectable gains in many countries, including the United States. They had increased prior to COVID, women-owned firms were 40% of all firms in the United States, which was substantial progress. I haven't seen the numbers on where they are now, but given the challenges women-owned firms faced and the industries that they focused on, I suspect that those percentages are lower. So I think it's important for us, as we all recover from COVID, to focus on those restorative kind of steps that will not only get women entrepreneurs back to where they were, but to help them advance even beyond that. And I think that really needs to be our focus going forward, because we don't need to start at a lower level. We need to get women back up to where they were and keep moving them forward, because the contributions they make, not only from the standpoint of economic contributions, job contributions, but also products, services, quality of life, contributions to the community. All of those things are so valuable, and they're things that we want to encourage and support. So thank you to the OECD for organizing this wonderful, wonderful program. And thank you to our speakers and panelists. I have just enjoyed it so much, and it's been such a pleasure to share this program with you today. So thank you, Jonathan.
No, that's it. That's it. Thanks to all the participants for participating, to all the panelists, to the speakers, to all the authors, to GWEP, and let's do something with this report and get some policy change and get the momentum going. So that's where we are now, and stay in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.